Dear Father James, thanks for the time and that you're willing to give us this interview. We from the St. Boniface Institute are obviously very interested in Catholic resistance, and our first question to you would be how can we convince other Catholics that they should be engaged in a resistance movement against more and more totalitarian government, given that Catholics are not really the most inclined to go on protests and demonstrations?
Our priority is certainly the supernatural goods, but grace builds on nature. So the more healthy a society is, the more public and full worship we can offer to God. So Jesus makes it clear we shouldn't be indifferent to someone who's sick or hungry. And the Catholic epistles that if someone is in need of clothing, we can't just pray for them and send them away, but we have to be involved in looking out for natural goods. And the political life of a country is about the highest natural good it can have. So if we sense that there's a growing injustice or people are being obstructed from a normal natural life, then we have a duty as much as we have an opportunity to resist that. Any group in power has the temptation to simply take more and more power. It's an act of charity toward them to put the brakes on if they are going out of line. So there's a relationship between the leaders and those who are led. It can't simply be one way, but those who are led need to give feedback to the leaders when they're going too far and put up a strong resistance for their own good, for their neighbor, and for the leaders.
And what different roles would you see for lay people and priests in this Catholic resistance movement?
The priests have a duty to have carefully studied the faith, and so they can give correction to lay people if they see error, or correct if they see there's a want of charity perhaps in the way resistance is happening. But they needn't try to control too much. If you're trying to ride a horse, you have to let the horse have its head if you want some speed. If a rider were to try to control every leg of the horse and where it put its feet down, it would be crippled. You wouldn't get anywhere. So the priests shouldn't try to control the laity, but give them access to the sacraments, most importantly, to teach the faith, and to be willing to see where the laity in their own proper field will lead in the world, bringing Catholic truth into the world, Catholic life. And the priests can be among them. One example is the public rosaries, which we're seeing in hundreds of locations across Europe and the world right now. These things don't have to be the initiative of a priest, but the priest could be among the flock. A shepherd with his sheep, he might know where the best pasture is and generally lead the sheep there, but he doesn't try to control where the whole flock goes every step of the way. But if they move in one way, he can be among them. These public rosaries are an example of what we need right now, the Mother of God. And priests and bishops would do well to see this massive movement across the world from lay people and be with them. The clergy should never sacrifice the supernatural for the natural, but they can't cut themselves off from the natural sphere.
And where does obedience stop? For example, we have now many priests and lay people who have a confrontation with each other because the priests want to keep it still and want to make sure that they still can say the Mass and everything. And many lay people are more like, we have to resist these measurements more and more. Where does the obedience stop?
Obedience is only ever due to a legitimate authority when it's giving an instruction that lies within their field to give.
So obviously we live in very changing times right now, let's say. What are your observations how the Church and how we as faithful Catholics practice the faith have changed over the last 2 years of the corona pandemic?
There's certainly many positive stories, not only about Catholics who realize what they could be deprived of, who are searching out the Mass more assiduously and growing closer to God. Many parishes have grown, normally where the priest is protecting the worship. But undoubtedly, there's been a massive falling away. The Mass has been treated by contempt, not just by the state, but by the hierarchy. The closure of churches is just unthinkable. The signal is sent to people that it's an option, it doesn't really matter. So the church has been devastated by self-inflicted wounds, and she was the only one that could have defended the whole world from this overreach of power. She has a global network, and in many countries where there's a more reasonable government who isn't trying to restrict worship or restrict their people too much, the church could have shown that they would carry on as normal. And wherever the life of the church is normal in one country, it helps it in other countries where the governments make it more difficult. But instead, we've seen an eagerness on the part of bishops to close churches, to enforce more restrictions than even the state was speaking of. And this is inexplicable, except that we've lost preparedness for death. There's such a fear of death and and the insane idea that we can control nature down to the last detail. We cannot control nature with technology. Nature will always win. We have to go with nature, and that includes being able to breathe. It should be fairly obvious. We see pictures of politicians standing with groups of children, and the children masked and the politicians not masked. This is so evil.
Why do you think it is that most of the church authority in almost all countries of the world complies with almost all of the measurements, or even, as you said it, makes it even worse for the faithful?
It's clear that the most powerful forces in the hierarchy have lost the sense of mission of the church. For 70 years, they've been following after the world. And when Corona came, these men their hearts are empty. Christ is not their priority. And so they take direction from the world. It's even more obvious in the attack now on tradition. Because you can't have both. You can't have traditional Catholic faith and the spirit of the world. The two are in enmity with each other. And if for 17 years there's been an increasing acceptance of and yearning for the spirit of the world within the church, to conform ourselves to the world, then tradition, they thought that they had got rid of that. They see they've not. It's the strongest life force there is on it, and it's coming back. And so now the attack against it is strong. Corona revealed this. It didn't cause anything.
How should we as Catholics use this situation of suffering and of restrictions of our freedom to personally develop in a good way?
It's a great warning to us all that to be on the back of Peter is not a cruise ship. There can be storms, there can be warfare, and all these things can be taken away from us unless we make them our absolute priority, to seek the kingdom of God before all else. If we do that, God will always give us away, and nothing can separate us from the love of Christ if it's our priority. But if there's anything that we count as more important, we risk losing it all. So taking this situation as a warning, we see how urgent it is for everybody now to educate themselves in the faith. We can no longer rely on the hierarchy. We have to have an ultimate recourse to them. But for day to day, year to year, one has to find good resources, be mixing with committed Catholics. And that's up to each family father or single person to find for themselves, or find for their family, or find for themselves. The more we learn about the faith, the more it draws us in. It's normally with food, for example, or drink, you have a certain amount and you lose your hunger or thirst, and that's enough. It's different with spiritual goods. The more you consume, the more you want. To drink of the things of heaven makes you more thirsty for them. To know Christ, you want to know him more. So Catholics, we can't sit back and wait to be given these things. As in the past, children would go to school and they could expect a solid Catholic catechism, living in a Catholic family, in a Catholic culture. It doesn't exist anymore. It's up to us to seek God, and we will find him.
Okay, going on to another topic. How do you, from your personal perspective, see the more and more schismatic development, especially in the German church? And what would you recommend faithful people in Germany, how they should react to it?
It's tragic. Obviously, one can learn a lot from the Reformation. There's a temptation as well to think, how can we stop this? How can we stop this? Maybe that's the wrong thought, because Jesus said he came to divide, to bring a sword. He wants to sift through us to see who loves him more than anything else. And the synodal weg is a great way of sifting souls, because those who want to follow the world will go this way. And those who want Christ will have to make so many sacrifices to stay connected with worthy masses and good instruction. Of course, we would like to see it end, but there's not much hope by appealing to Rome, for example. Rome is not trying to discipline this, but is trying to make it universal, trying to make it global, with the Synod of Synods, with the same purpose and goals. So we have to take such recourse to God the Father. He's the only one. When I was a kid, like most boys, you kind of trust that your father is the strongest, best dad there is in the world. And so you don't have fear as you're going about your life. And then when I was in my 20s and was in prison in Burma, I had a perhaps naive belief that the governments of the world were on the whole good and trustworthy, and that there could be an appeal to the law and to a desire for freedom. And so even if you're in a difficult position, ultimately there's a benevolent force, a natural force, human force that can help out. Now in the church, in a way, we've lost that benevolent fatherhood in the hierarchy. And we have to go purely to God the Father through his Son. But he is, of course, the best, the biggest, the strongest, the most perfect Father there is. So we still have absolutely nothing to fear. But if we're not calling upon the Father in heaven, then those fathers on earth will abuse the family of the church further and further. In a family, if a father is beating their wife and the children, the elder brothers have to stop him. It's their duty. And right now in the church, the elder brothers aren't doing that, the cardinals, the bishops. So the younger brothers must do it. That means priests and lay people. The lay people are leading, absolutely leading now in giving the best teaching and in correcting the abuses that are coming from Rome and the German bishops. I think of Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. If only his teaching were being given by Rome every week. It's so solid, and they don't have the fear that priests have. In a normal family, there's a trust and exchange between the parents and the children. In a tyranny, it's all controlled by fear. And that's what we have now between priests and bishops. It's not the relationship of father and son, where you can speak openly about what you really think without fear of a punishment from the bishop. If a priest says he doesn't fear his bishop, that may be because they're both sleeping together. But so many good priests fear their bishops, and the advice of prudence is be silent. Don't say what you're thinking. It's going to bring terrible repercussions on you, on others, on the parish. Be silent. This is so unhealthy for any family, and it's a disaster in the church. It shows us nothing of God the Father, who is the opposite of this way of handling his children. It would be interesting to ask other priests if they would, what they say to this. Are they afraid of their bishops to say what they really think? I think most priests would say, no, I'm not afraid of my bishop. So can you really say to him exactly what you think about what's happening in the liturgy, about what's happening in the Stephansdom in Vienna, for example, several times per year, the sacrileges that happen there? How many priests can tell the cardinal what they think? And if the cardinal doesn't hear it, it will continue.
But isn't it a complete perversion of the natural hierarchy that we have in the church? That we have lay people that say priests how they should dress, how they should say mass, and that we have priests who say how their bishops should behave, and bishops who don't trust the Pope. So don't we see a complete destruction of the hierarchy that
Not
we
at
should
all.
have?
Not at all. The church is indefectible in her constitution, divinely given by God, and all that. And so, for example, infallibility can be concentrated in the Pope. If he's holy and seeking the will of God, he will be able to exercise infallibility when he teaches on faith and morals. But it's also in the lay of the bishops when they're in communion with the Pope and seeking the will of God. They will be protected by this grace. But again, it's also in the level of the whole church, of the laity, the sensus fidelium, so that when the enemy attacks the Pope and injures him spiritually, you can rely on the bishops to protect the church. And when the enemy is so organized and determined and committed and has been rolling out a program for decades to weaken and undermine the bishops, as we now are suffering, we can rely on the whole church, on the lay people, to assert the true Catholic faith and to call the hierarchy back to their duty, to put God absolutely first. And that's what's happening now. And the enemy hates it because it takes him so much work to get hold of the Pope and so much work to get hold of half the bishops in the world, or 20%, whatever it is. But there's no way he will ever be able to control all Catholics. There's no way you will rip God from people's hearts so there won't be beautiful souls and groups and networks calling the hierarchy back to their duty, to the faith. And the enemy will be forever frustrated. If God knew all history in advance, he knew where the attacks would come from. And he knew that after so many centuries, the enemies would see that it is the papacy and it is the episcopacy which are such a strength in the church. And so they've concentrated so much fire on them. God's seen it all coming. And so a body, when you're sick, you may lose consciousness when you're sick, but the body doesn't shut down, right? So we may lose Rome for a season in terms of it not being conscious, it not giving us the truth. But the body's still alive and the body's still regulating itself. The control of it, or the health of the body isn't located only in the brain. So if the brain is dormant for a while, the body can continue, and of course the brain will in due course recover. In the body of the church, the head, the visible head on earth, will be healthy again before the end. So lay people have to, it's not so much taking a lead, it's simply defending what they know to be true. If a child is cold or in pain, they can't just sit there quietly thinking their parents are mind readers. Often a mother knows what's wrong with the child, perhaps before a child knows. A mother can tell by looking at her baby what they need. But by nature, the child has to cry, right? If he's hungry or needs to be changed, or is cold or uncomfortable, the child will cry. So on a much bigger scale, more mature scale, the laity people have to cry out when they see that the hierarchy have abandoned the mission of the church.
Okay, thank you, Father James, for your time, and please keep us in your prayers, and we'll do the same thing, and God bless.
Absolutely, God bless.
Thank you.